In this video I'm going to be talking to you about growing winter squash. Now this is a plant that needs starting off early because they've got a very long growing season, so I like to start them from around about the first week of March, maybe a little bit later depending on how sunny it is outside, and you can carry on sowing them until around about May time. Now, how do I go about sowing these? Well, first of all, it does depend on your variety and how large the seeds are, but we've got a Crown Prince here, and these are considered one of the most tasty, and they certainly store very well. And when we're popping them in the compost, and this is compost I made, show you how to make in video 1, we need to make sure they go in an upright position, and this is in order to ensure that the water doesn't actually accumulate on the top of the seed, because then there's chances it might rot. So pop them down into the compost. And importantly, that one's a little bit low, we need to make sure that we just give them a gentle firming. And I do mean gentle, it's just so you're making contact with the surface of the soil. And there we go, a little bit more in those ones as well. Now, these should be okay on a sunny windowsill, however, the weather's gone a little bit cooler, so I'm going to give these an extra advantage by making a mini propagator. And you can do this out of materials that you have lying around at home. First of all, let me give these a little bit of water. So the idea of a propagator is that it just increases the temperature, and it also cuts down the need to water your seedlings because it'll be a much moister environment inside the propagator. Oops. So this is a tray that I bought some mushrooms in. This came with some other vegetables, I think, but I'm not entirely sure. It's a good idea to keep hold of these for times like these. And you can tie it on with a rubber band if you have the right size rubber band, but failing that, grab a piece of twine or string and pop it in like so. So you'll see I've tied a loop at one end. That just makes this whole process easier. And try and line them up actually with the grooves on the box. That helps quite a bit. Pull it relatively tight and then just do a very simple knot, because obviously at some point you are going to want to actually be able to get back in there, so a simple knot will allow you to do that. And there we go, pop on a sunny windowsill, and they should emerge in around about 2 weeks time. So these are some seedlings that I started off around about 3 weeks ago, and it was nice and sunny then, so they've had a really good growing period. When these are about 15 centimetres tall, they can actually be planted out into the garden or into a greenhouse. If you're going to grow them in a greenhouse, in a pot, make sure it's the largest pot you've got. I'm going to be putting them in this bed here. The important thing is you need to give them plenty of room. They are big plants, so the recommended distance is around about 1 metre between plant centres. If you don't, the risks of the disease are much greater, so it's well worth following that advice. If you cramp them all together, they're going to be competing both for nutrients, and also the possibilities of disease being spread between them is greater because there's less airflow. 2 weeks before you plant your seedlings out, and that's probably going to be around about the end of May, possibly early June, you need to create a little pocket for these plants to go in. So you're going to do that by digging down about a spade's depth and then filling with a good quality compost, or you can use a mixture of topsoil mixed well with manure. And then you're going to finish that hole off with a dressing of a multi-purpose fertiliser. So this is a seaweed based one, which I use as my standard fertiliser for growing vegetables. Then come back in 2 weeks time and then plant your plants in it. And when you do, again, apply a little bit more fertiliser to the surface of the soil, and you're going to do that approximately once a month until the fruits start to show, at which point you might want to consider moving over to using one of these fertilisers, which is tomato fertiliser, which is low in nitrogen but high in potassium and phosphorus. When watering your squash seedlings, you do need to make sure that you don't splash the leaves, because unfortunately this can encourage mildew to develop. And also I'd recommend never watering the stem of the plant either, because that can cause it to rot. So ideally you want to water in a donut shape around the plant so it goes on the roots and not the rest of the plant. And you're going to do this regularly. Little and often is often the best way of doing it, and make sure the soil is indeed damp by testing it with your finger. If it is, don't water that day. The other thing that you need to consider is if you do develop mildew, and that's like a white fungal bloom on the surface of the leaves, then get rid of the affected parts of the plant immediately, because if it spreads, you're probably going to have to get rid of the whole plant. It's a very easy disease to transmit. Also, you might find that your leaves start to go a little bit yellow, in which case apply some more compost to the surface of the soil, apply it as a mulch, but don't let it touch the plant stem because that won't help. And the last thing you need to be aware of is that squashes do suffer from blossom end rot, and it's a sign of low calcium in the soil. It's a little bit hard to rectify once it's already happening, because it probably is a problem with the soil that you've grown them in. But you can reduce the likelihood of this happening by, again, not planting your plants too close together and doing all the essential watering guidelines that I've given you. Although squashes are self-fertile because they have male and female flowers on the same plant, when you grow them indoors, it can be difficult to actually produce fruit simply because pollinators aren't reaching the plants. So on that basis, you need to be able to step in and do that job yourself. So you need to know the difference between a male flower, which has a simple stem, and a female flower, which has an underdeveloped fruit at the base of the flower. So what you do is you take a male flower, you cut it off, you peel the petals back, and you take it over to the female flower and gently open that flower and introduce the pollinating parts of the male flower to the female flower. And you want to do that for at least half a minute to get a really good spread of pollen from one flower to the other. And if you do that, you're going to have a much higher success rate in the number of fruits that you produce. And when those fruits do start to develop, it's a really good idea to make sure that you put a piece of slate or a tile underneath those fruits so they're not resting directly on the surface of the soil, and that way you'll cut down on any possibility of them developing skin damage because they're too wet. Winter squashes have hard skins, which means they do store well. So any fruits that you gather at the end of summer going into autumn, you can store for maybe between 3 and 6 months depending on the variety. The important thing is, do store them correctly. They need to go in a relatively cool environment, somewhere away from moisture, preferably somewhere even that's dark, and that way they will store very well for long periods, providing the skin's not damaged. If the skin were to be damaged or you notice any softening on the fruit, then they won't store any longer and eat them immediately.